Hello and welcome to the ICT4D Conference podcast, where we are exploring the use of digital technologies and data innovations to address global development and humanitarian challenges. My name is Sonja Ritzel. I'm at CRS, and I'm interviewing experts for you from our global in-person conference earlier this year in Ghana. We're now sharing some of the key takeaways and lessons learned from the discussions and workshops. Today, it's my pleasure to speak with Alexander Bertram. He is the founder and executive director of ActivityInfo. Alexander, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Sonja. It's nice to join you on the podcast.
So, Alex, before we start, do you want to tell us a little bit more about ActivityInfo and as a background?
Yeah, it'd be my pleasure. ActivityInfo is a software platform that came out of my work almost 15 years ago with UNICEF when I used to work as an information management officer in Eastern Congo. Yeah, like UNICEF, like all organizations, I think working in this space was really struggling to bring together impact data, output data, information about their programming that was implemented by, other NGOs, others working across a really large geographic area. And we just had the idea that we could use technology, we could use this at that time, web applications to make it easier to collect data from across many different organizations, bring that data together in one place, and actually be able to use that data to to improve the programming, to identify gaps, to ultimately learn from, the data that was out there. And so that was the start of ActivityInfo back in 2008. And when I left the Congo, I started the company BeDataDriven to support ActivityInfo. Since then, the software has grown to be used in about 100 countries, and we have about 40,000 active users every year in the humanitarian and social sector. So it's really a pleasure to be able to work with such a diverse range of organizations.
Thank you very much, Alex. Today, we want to talk about information management, since you mentioned data is important, and I think a lot of our organizations are really collecting a lot of data, and we have a lot of information. My first question is really about the evolvement of information management and technology in the social sector. So if you can tell us a little bit more how you see this and where we are at the moment and how we want to approach this. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think when I started my career, actually maybe a little earlier than UNICEF, working for the UN in Afghanistan, 2005, 2006, the biggest challenge there is that we had very little data. And I think around that time, you had the emergence of an array of tools from ODK and then COBO and others that really enabled humanitarians to start collecting a lot more data than we had before in a structured way. Synthesize data from multiple surveys to understand the impact on beneficiaries or rights holders over time. How do you pull together data from across programs to be able to understand what's working and maybe what could be improved? And so that's really our focus here at ActivityInfo, is this idea of how do you manage this information? And what we see is that can't really be an afterthought. You really have to start planning from the beginning. How are you going to structure your data collection in a way that enables you to relate that data to other elements in your program so that you can follow a participant across multiple touch point, multiple interactions, and multiple outcomes? And, how do you structure your information system so that that data is made available to project managers, to M&E staff, to other stakeholders in a timely way? Because I think so often what we see is that organizations, they collect a lot of data. It lives in spreadsheets or in mobile data collection tools. And the effort to bring all of that data together in a single picture, it just really exhausts all your available time and resources. So by the time that you've cleaned up all of this data, you've brought it together and finally start to get a picture of what's going on, the program is kind of finished, or it's too late to really have that decisive impact that I think we would all like data to have. So that's our focus on the kind of information management and structure of data.
Thank you, Alex. So obviously, now we have all these challenges. So how do organizations and information management to deal with these challenges and to actually have a better impact of the decision making based on the data they're collecting and to improve the results of the programs? Do you have some examples you came across?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We see ourselves as playing a role there and helping organizations structure their data collection, data management with ActivityInfo. And it's really exciting to me to see the results of that in some of the organizations we work with. So I mean, one example that I tend to retell a lot, but it made a big impression on me from the early days of ActivityInfo is when we rolled out the system for NFI cluster in Congo. One of the things that the cluster had decided was to include female hygiene kits in the NFI kits that were being distributed. And this was a global discussion. Everybody was on board, but it wasn't until the cluster started monitoring that with ActivityInfo to see, how many kits are we actually distributing? They saw that there was really a gap between the commitment and the practice. And they were able to use the system, the monitoring system for the cluster to go back to the members of the cluster and say, hey, let's not forget this commitment. Let's follow through on this and then monitor over the course of 18, 24 months to ensure that the number of kits, the percentage of kits, including FHIs, were actually increasing so that we were actually able to translate this commitment into practical impact. And that's a really simple thing. It's just following one number over time. But I think it's an important one. On the other side of complexity is we work with a lot of organizations that do market systems interventions where they're working with farmers in developing countries to help them improve their yields, to help them improve the income, so that that can ultimately lead to better outcomes for their family. And one of the things that it's really exciting to see some of the organizations we work with is that they're able to survey their participants in these programs over time, correlate that with the interventions that they're undertaking, and really start to tease out what has the most influence, right? Is it the training that we're doing? Farmers who received 3 times training, did that have more of an impact than a single intervention? Is it the loans? Is it the type of loans? Being able to really understand and make those kinds of comparisons as the program's unfolding, right? So not just something that's done years after the program has closed, but during the program's execution over the course of 3-4 years, I think really allows them to make decisions in a way that is quite exciting, because ultimately they're able to choose to put resources into types of activities and interventions that have the most impact. So those are 2 examples that I think where we'd like to help the sector move to really make use of that data to drive tangible outcomes.
Thank you so much for sharing those examples. But I guess the other big question is always, how do we take those lessons learned from one program and can then either scale those up, those learnings, or obviously replicate those learnings into a different program or a different scenario, a different country? So those kind of challenges, how can we address that? What sort of ideas do you have or experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I mean, my background, I think, personally, I was coming more from the technology side. I always, even though I did my degree in international studies, I was really always interested in software and in tinkering with computers. And so I think that's something that took me personally a while to understand, that often when scaling up, it's not just about the technology. It really requires putting resources into strong systems, into training, into skill development, into finding ways to create, things like governance structures, right? So if you're an organization that wants to replicate something that's working in one country to 30, 40 countries, how do you provide oversight so that you can come up with some standard operating procedures, like some best practices, but then to have the systems in place to follow up and see, is each country following these best practices? Are they following the processes that we think work? And if those processes aren't working in other contexts, how do we feed that back to revise our systems, to improve our systems over time? So I think as you scale up, having technology that's easy to use, that's user-friendly, that works well across a wide range of environments is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to start thinking about these kinds of human processes, making sure that you have a team centrally that can provide support to individuals working in the field across the organization. And that's something that I think we're learning a lot from the organizations we're working with, and trying to distill those into best practices. I hope that we'll have a chance to do the ICT4D webinar where we'll share some of those best practices and across a couple of our key organization partners.
Thank you. That is, I guess, a message we hear often with scaling up, as it really goes beyond having the right technology, but really the team on board and the right infrastructure in place. And that is certainly something that many of us cannot do in solo. So I think that's why collaborations and partnerships are very important. And on that note, we will definitely have more information about ActivityInfo and BeDataDriven in the podcast description for anybody to learn more about your organization. Do you have any other comments and remarks before we close off this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to thank everybody that we had a chance to meet at IC4D in Ghana. It was really great to see so many people from the last 15 years that were there and new faces, and to see the energy behind technology and using technology in the social sector. I would just say one thing that I try to keep in mind is to keep focused on the outcomes. Like, what are we trying to do as technologists? Like, what are the ultimate goals? How does the technology that we're developing, how does that connect with, ultimately the beneficiaries, the rights holders that we're trying to support, and the goals of our broader organizations? And I think if we can do all of that as a community, that's really exciting. So thanks for the chance to speak with you today, Sonia. And yeah, I look forward to the next ICT4D in 2 years.
Thank you so much, Alex. Wonderful closing. I could not add anything else. So thank you so much for your insights into information management and also for supporting our conference. Thank you so much for your time today as well.
My pleasure, Sonia.
Thank you for listening to our ICT4D conference podcast. I'm your host, Sonja Rützel, and I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please leave us a review, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you.